My name is Damon Brown, and my question is, after Sandy, does the United States have enough political will to enact reforms to address climate change? In 1981, when being interviewed, President Ronald Reagan was asked what he thinks contributes to pollution the most. His response was that trees cause more pollution than automobiles. Unfortunately, that's just not true. And although in 2012, our politicians are able to make the difference between carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, that doesn't mean they're actually addressing the problems that we're facing when it comes to climate change. And after Sandy, there is a crisis, an environmental crisis, that must be dealt with. Which is probably why William Cliff was quoted in the Wall Street Journal on November 8th of this year. And he said that when it comes to natural disasters, they're only going to increase and become costlier. He notes that Hurricane Sandy cost a whopping $50 billion, and that industry production decreased by 0.4%. So, when posed with the question, after Sandy, does the United States have enough political will to enact reforms to address climate change? The unfortunate answer is no. More specifically, for three main reasons. First, because the fiscal cliff will be at the center of Congress for a long time. Secondly, because there's so much political gridlock that even if a bill is in Congress, that doesn't mean it will be passed. And finally, because social issues are becoming more increasingly important than our environmental crisis. To understand why the United States will not have enough willpower to enact reforms to address climate change, it's most important to look to our first point of analysis, and that's realizing that the fiscal cliff is here to stay. The Wall Street Journal notes on November 3rd of 2012 that when it comes to this crisis, the biggest problem we're facing with the fiscal cliff is deficit reduction versus increase in taxes. And unfortunately, there has not been any compromise from Democrats or Republicans. But Isabel Salhem, who is the co-director for the Center of our National Priorities, scribes in the Brookings Institute article, The Way of Our World, on November 7th of 2012, that the best way to address taxes is to wait to enact provisions by 2014, because that will help ensure that we do not hurt our fragile economy. Finally, in Jacob Hacker's book, Winner Take All Politics, he argues that the economy will always be more important than our environmental problems. So unless we solve the long-term solutions that we're faced with when it comes to our deficit reduction issues, then other policies simply will not matter, especially the environmental policies that we're facing. Because right now, many people seem just not to care about them. So, because the fiscal cliff will remain at the center of Congress, that's one reason why we will not be able to enact legislation to address climate change. The second reason is because there is so much political gridlock within Congress. For analysis on this, we turn to a Gallup poll on October 24th of 2012 that indicates that gridlock in Congress has been named dysfunctional politics, and that our rate of approval is at a whopping 19%, the lowest it's ever been. What that emphasizes is that Democrats and Republicans are going to have to come together, but they simply haven't, which is probably why Megan Bradley, environmental expert and fellow for the Brookings Institute, indicates on November 14th of 2012 that even legislation to address mitigating our natural disasters have been rejected in Congress. She notes that inland waterway systems and seawalls have been rejected. So, if Congress can't even get legislation through that addresses mitigating the impacts of natural disasters, there is no way we're going to get reforms to address climate change as a whole. And Fred Gruttel warns us in his book, The Fate of Our Species, that although disease and viruses are two things that will hurt the human race, what's most important is climate change. He argues that the reason why is because we can learn to control disease and we can learn to control viruses, but we cannot predict or control natural disasters, which stem from climate change itself. So because there's so much political gridlock within Congress, Even if legislation was proposed to fix our environmental crisis, that doesn't mean that reforms to address climate change will actually be passed. The third reason why we're not going to have reforms that ensure that we address our climate change issue is because social issues have been put ahead of our environmental problems that we're facing. For analysis on this, we turn to an article from the Council on Foreign Relations when they postulate on November 8th of 2012 that the United States simply did not learn its lesson when it comes to Hurricane Sandy. Because what the author indicts is that even though we recognize there is a problem, there was no willpower to fix it, and that social issues have been put above them by a large margin. And this trend has been trending since 2001. That's exactly what the Washington Post concluded on November 8th of 2012. But the Huffington Post gave more statistics when they indicate that when comparing how important the environment is to our natural disasters, the article cites that 2/3 of America view social issues as being a lot more important. Unfortunately, because social issues are viewed to be so much more important, in 2013, there will not be a lot of people trying to address the problems that we're facing when it comes to climate change. And that's exactly what the Christian Science Monitor notes on November 3rd of 2012. Unfortunately, what this means for our climate change activists is that things can go from bad to really worse really quick. You know, like the Kansas City Chiefs. So, because we're facing so many problems, but that social issues have been put above our environmental issues, that's one reason why the United States does not have enough willpower to enact reforms to address climate change. What this means for the American people is that our environmental problems are going to continue to get worse unless we find a way to really address them. So, when we return back to today's question, after Sandy, does the United States have enough political will to enact reforms to address climate change? The answer is unfortunately no. More specifically, for three main reasons. First, because the fiscal crisis will be at the center of climate change. Secondly, because when it comes to political gridlock, there's simply too much to pass any bills. And finally, because social issues are going to be a big problem for the United States, not our environmental crisis. But it's important to go back to the words of Ronald Reagan when he says that